Danny Cole had seen enough war to last 3 lifetimes. 20 years in the Terran Defense Corps had taken him across dozens of worlds, through battles that still visited him in dreams he would rather forget. Now, at 52 years old, he wanted nothing more than quiet. He found that quiet on Haven 7, a frontier colony world where humans and alien refugees had learned to live side by side after the Galactic Integration Treaty opened the borders 3 years ago. He worked as a groundskeeper at Haven Primary Academy, a school where children of different species learned together. It was simple work. He fixed heating systems when they broke. He cleared pathways after storms. He repaired fences and maintained gardens and made sure the building stayed standing. Nobody asked him about the war. Nobody expected him to be a hero. He was just the maintenance man, and that suited him perfectly. The school itself was a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings surrounded by open fields and carefully planted trees from a dozen different worlds. Human children ran alongside young with their 4 arms and spotted skin. Tiny buzzed about on delicate wings while the tall and graceful walked with measured steps. And then there were the refugees from a world that no longer existed, their pale blue skin and large silver eyes marking them as survivors of the Dominion Wars. Danny had fought against the Dominion. He had seen what their forces did to worlds that refused to submit. The had been one of those worlds, reduced to rubble and ash while its people scattered across the galaxy looking for any place that would take them. Haven 7 had taken them, and now their children sat in classrooms learning mathematics and history alongside human kids who had never known anything but peace. It was during his morning rounds that Danny first noticed her. He was checking the irrigation systems near the eastern field when the lunch bell rang and children poured out of the buildings like water from a broken dam. They spread across the grounds in groups, clustering by species and friendship, and the mysterious social rules that children everywhere seemed to understand instinctively. But one child did not join any group. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old by human standards, walked alone to the far edge of the schoolyard where an old earth oak tree spread its branches. She sat down with her back against the trunk and opened a lunchbox that she pulled from her small bag. Danny watched from a distance as he pretended to adjust a sprinkler head. The girl looked into her lunchbox for a long moment. Then she closed it without taking anything out. She sat there for the entire lunch period, holding the closed box in her lap, staring at nothing while the sounds of playing children echoed across the field. He told himself it was none of his business. He told himself that he did not know anything about customs and that maybe this was normal for them. He told himself that the teachers and administrators would notice if something was wrong and that it was not his place to interfere. But the next day he found himself near that same tree during lunch, and the girl was there again. Same spot, same routine. She opened the lunchbox, looked inside, and closed it without eating. She sat alone until the bell called everyone back to class. On the third day, Danny positioned himself where he could see her more clearly. The other children played together in a group near the main building, their silver eyes bright with laughter as they engaged in some game he did not recognize. But none of them approached the girl under the tree. None of them even looked in her direction. It was as if she did not exist to them. The human children seemed equally uncertain. A few glanced her way with curiosity, but something in her posture discouraged approach. She sat so still and so silent that she might have been a statue carved from ice and left there to slowly melt in the sun. Danny knew that look. He had seen it in the eyes of soldiers who had lost too much too quickly. He had seen it in refugees huddled in evacuation ships, clutching the few possessions they had managed to save while their worlds burned behind them. He had seen it in his own mirror during the dark years after his discharge, when the silence of civilian life felt louder than any battlefield. On the fourth day, he made a decision. He finished his morning tasks early and packed his own lunch, a simple sandwich made from bread and vegetables grown in his small garden. When the lunch bell rang, he walked across the field toward the old oak tree. The girl looked up as he approached. Her silver eyes were enormous in her delicate face, and Danny could see the way her thin fingers tightened around the lunchbox in her lap. She was afraid of him. That made sense. She was a child alone, and he was a large human man walking toward her with unknown intentions. He stopped several feet away and lowered himself slowly to the ground, sitting with his back against a different part of the tree trunk. He did not look directly at her. He did not say anything. He simply opened his lunch and began to eat his sandwich in small, unhurried bites. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Danny finished half his sandwich and watched a group of children chase each other through the air above the playing field. The girl sat motionless, her lunchbox still closed in her lap. Finally, Danny broke the silence. His voice was quiet and calm, the same voice he had used long ago when approaching frightened civilians in war zones. He said that his name was Danny and that he worked here taking care of the grounds. He said that he liked this tree because it reminded him of one that grew near his childhood home on Earth. He asked if she minded him sitting here. The girl studied him for a long moment, then she shook her head slowly. She did not mind. Danny nodded and returned to his sandwich. He did not push for more. He did not ask her name or why she sat alone or what was in the lunchbox she guarded so carefully. He simply sat with her in companionable silence until the bell rang and she gathered her things and walked back toward the school building. She paused once and looked back at him. Danny raised his hand in a small wave. She did not wave back, but something in her expression shifted slightly before she turned away. It was not much. It was barely anything at all. But Danny had learned long ago that sometimes barely anything was exactly where healing began. Danny returned to the oak tree the next day and the day after that. He brought his lunch and sat in the same spot and ate in silence while the girl sat a few feet away with her unopened lunchbox. He did not pressure her to talk. He did not ask questions. He simply showed up, reliable as the sunrise, and let her decide what to do with his presence. On the 5th day, she told him her name. She said it so quietly that he almost missed it, a whisper carried on the breeze. Danny nodded and said it was a nice name. Then he went back to his sandwich, and they sat together in silence for the rest of lunch. On the 7th day, she asked him what was in his sandwich. Danny showed her, pulling apart the bread to reveal layers of tomato and lettuce, and a spread made from beans grown in his garden. Studied it with her large silver eyes and asked if humans always ate plants crushed between other plants. Danny laughed, a real laugh that surprised him, and said that when she put it that way it did sound strange. By the end of the 2nd week, they had developed a routine. Danny would arrive first and settle against the tree, would appear a few minutes later and take her usual spot. Sometimes they talked about small things, the weather, the different trees in the schoolyard, the games the other children played. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable quiet and watched the clouds drift overhead. But never opened her lunchbox. She held it in her lap every day, her fingers tracing the edges, but she never lifted the lid in his presence. Danny noticed but did not comment. He had his own secrets. He understood that some things needed time. It was on a gray afternoon during the 3rd week when everything changed. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and most of the children had stayed inside the covered pavilion to eat, but came to the tree as always, and Danny was there waiting. She seemed different that day. Her movements were slower. Her silver eyes kept drifting to the lunchbox in her hands as if it contained something that both drew and repelled her. Danny ate his sandwich and waited. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. She said she wanted to show him something. She said she had never shown anyone before. She said she did not know why she wanted to show him now, only that she did. Danny set his sandwich aside and gave her his full attention. He said she did not have to show him anything she was not ready to share. He said that whatever was in that box was her business and hers alone. Shook her head. She said she needed someone to see. She said the weight of carrying it alone had become too heavy. She lifted the lid. Danny leaned forward slightly, expecting to see spoiled food or perhaps nothing at all. What he saw instead made his breath catch in his throat. Resting on a small cloth inside the lunchbox was a crystalline sphere no larger than a marble. It glowed with faint inner light, soft pulses of blue and white that seemed to move like a heartbeat. Danny recognized it immediately. During his years of service, he had encountered culture in many forms. He knew what he was looking at. It was a memory stone. They created them to preserve the final thoughts and feelings of the dying. They were sacred objects, deeply personal, meant to carry the essence of those who had passed on. He asked who the stone belonged to. Her mother. The word came out broken, sharp-edged with grief. Her mother had made this recording before the Dominion destroyed there, before the fire fell from the sky and turned everything had ever known to ash. Her mother had pressed this stone into the hands of a neighbor and begged them to find and give it to her. The neighbor had found her 3 months later in a refugee camp orbiting a world whose name could not pronounce. Danny sat very still. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He did not say he understood, because how could anyone truly understand the weight of holding their mother's final moments in a box meant for food? He asked why she carried it in a lunchbox. Explained that she was afraid to leave it anywhere. She was afraid that if she let it out of her sight, something would happen to it. Someone might take it. It might get lost or broken, and then she would have nothing left of her mother at all. Danny nodded slowly. That made sense. In a universe that had taken everything from her, this small glowing stone was all she had left. But that did not explain why she never ate. His hands shook as she closed the lunchbox again, hiding the stone from view. She said that children did not eat alone. She said that meals were shared experiences, connected through the telepathic bonds that linked families. Parents and children would feel each other's presence while they ate, a warm thread of connection that made the simple act of consuming food into something meaningful. She had not felt that warmth since her mother died. Eating alone felt wrong. Eating without that connection felt like betraying everything her mother had been. So she did not eat, not at school, not where anyone could see. Sometimes at night, when the loneliness became unbearable, she would force herself to swallow a few bites, but it never felt right. It always felt like loss. Danny was quiet for a long time after she finished speaking. The first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the leaves above their heads. Neither of them moved to find shelter. Finally, Danny reached into his bag and pulled out the remains of his sandwich. He held it out, not to her, but setting it on the ground between them. An offering, a bridge. He said he could not replace what she had lost. He said he was not and could not share her bond. But he said that if she wanted, she would not have to eat alone anymore. He would sit with her every day, rain or shine, for as long as she needed. She would not have to feel that emptiness by herself. Stared at the sandwich sitting on the grass between them. The rain fell harder, soaking through their clothes, but still neither moved. She did not eat that day, but for the first time, she did not close the lunchbox and hide it away. She left it open beside her, the memory stone glowing softly, while the rain washed over them both like a promise of something new. The weeks that followed took on a new rhythm. Danny and met under the oak tree every lunch period without fail. The rain gave way to sunshine, and the sunshine surrendered to clouds, and through it all they sat together in their small corner of the schoolyard. Began to talk more. At first it came in fragments, scattered pieces of memory that surfaced without warning. She would describe the color of the sky on her, a deep purple that turned gold at sunset. She would mention a song her mother used to sing, though she could not remember all the words. She would talk about crystal forests that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows, and rivers that seemed to sing as they flowed over stones worn smooth by centuries of water. Danny listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions unless she seemed to want them. He simply received her stories like precious gifts and held them carefully in his heart. In return, he shared pieces of himself. He told her about Earth, a world so far away that light itself took years to make the journey. He described oceans so vast that you could sail for weeks without seeing land, and mountains so tall that their peaks were always covered in snow. He talked about his childhood home, a small house with a garden where his mother grew vegetables and his father built furniture by hand. He also told her about the war, not the battles themselves, not the violence and death that still haunted his dreams, but the quieter truths that lived in the spaces between. He told her about losing friends, about watching good people die for reasons that seemed less important with each passing year, about coming home to a world that had moved on without him, and finding that he no longer fit in the spaces he had left behind. He told her about the years after his discharge, when the silence had pressed in on him like a weight he could not lift, when food had lost its taste and sleep had become an enemy, when he had wondered more than once whether the universe would notice if he simply stopped existing. Listened with those enormous silver eyes, and Danny saw understanding there. Not the understanding of someone who had experienced the exact same pain, but the recognition of someone who knew what it felt like to be hollowed out by loss. She asked him how he had survived. Danny thought about the question for a long time. He said he was not sure he had any good answers. He said that some days he had survived simply by refusing to give up, by putting one foot in front of the other even when every step felt impossible. He said that eventually, little by little, the weight had become something he could carry instead of something that crushed him. He said he did not think the grief ever went away completely. He thought maybe it just changed shape over time, becoming part of who you were instead of something that destroyed you. Nodded slowly, she said she hoped that was true. Their daily meetings did not go unnoticed. Administrator, the woman who ran the school, called Danny into her office one afternoon. She was a tall being with 4 arms and skin mottled in shades of gray and brown, and her expression carried the careful neutrality of someone trained in diplomacy. She said she had received reports about his interactions with the child. She said she needed to understand his intentions. Danny explained simply. He said he had noticed a child who seemed alone and hurting. He said he had started sitting with her because nobody else did. He said he meant no harm and asked for nothing in return except the chance to offer what small comfort his presence might provide. Administrator was quiet for a moment. Then she said that Danny needed to understand the cultural complexities involved. There were a proud people with ancient traditions around mourning and loss. Some in the refugee community might view a human interfering in a child's grief process as inappropriate. Some might even see it as an insult. Danny nodded. He said he understood her concerns. Then he asked a question that had been sitting in his chest for weeks. He asked how many had come to sit with. He asked how many of her own people had reached out to her since she arrived at this school. He asked whether any of the adults who worried about cultural sensitivity had bothered to notice that a child was starving herself because she was too lonely to eat. Administrator had no answer. Danny stood up and said that he meant no disrespect to anyone's culture or traditions. He said that he was just an old soldier who had learned long ago that grief did not care about species or customs. He said that a child in pain was a child in pain, and that he would not stop being there for simply because it made some people uncomfortable. He walked out of the office before she could respond. That evening, he sat on the porch of his small house and watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. He thought about all the worlds out there, all the lives being lived and lost and struggled through. He thought about how small they all were against the vastness of the universe, and yet how much it mattered when one person reached out to another across that impossible distance. He thought about holding her mother's memory in a lunchbox because she had nowhere else safe to put it. He thought about the families who had not come to help her, and the human families who had not known how, and the enormous gulf that existed between wanting to do good and actually doing it. He made himself dinner and ate it alone, and he wondered whether was eating tonight or whether she was lying awake in some refugee housing unit, hungry and hurting and waiting for morning, so she could sit under a tree with an old man who had nothing to offer but his presence. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough, but it was what he had, and he would keep giving it until something changed. Arrived at the oak tree looking different than Danny had ever seen her. There was tension in her shoulders and a troubled light in her silver eyes that spoke of sleepless hours and painful thoughts. She sat down in her usual spot, but did not greet him. She simply stared at the lunchbox in her hands as if it held answers to questions she was afraid to ask. Danny waited. He had learned that pushing never helped. She would speak when she was ready, and until then his job was simply to be present. After a long silence, she told him what had happened. That morning, before school, she had tried to activate the memory stone. She had wanted to hear her mother's voice again. She had needed to feel that connection, even if it was just a recording, even if it was just an echo of something that no longer existed. But the stone had not responded. She had held it in her hands and poured all her focus into it, the way her mother had taught her years ago, and nothing had happened. The crystal had remained dark and silent, holding its secrets locked away where she could not reach them. She was afraid the stone was broken. She was afraid that somehow she had damaged it by carrying it around all these months. She was afraid that her last link to her mother was gone forever. Danny considered what he knew about technology. During his service, he had worked alongside soldiers and civilians. He had seen memory stones used in funeral ceremonies and in private moments of grief. He understood the basics of how they functioned, even if he could never use one himself. He asked what she had felt when she tried to activate the stone. She answered without hesitation: grief, loneliness, the desperate aching need to connect with something that was no longer there, fear that she was forgetting her mother's face, her mother's voice, the way her mother's presence had felt in the back of her mind like a warm hand holding hers in the dark. Danny nodded slowly. He said he had a question, and he asked her to think carefully before answering. He asked her what her mother had been feeling when she made that recording. His brow furrowed. She said she did not understand the question. Danny explained. Memory stones did not just store thoughts and words. They stored emotional resonance, the feelings of the person who created them. To unlock that resonance, the person receiving the message needed to match that emotional signature. The stone was not a lock that could be opened with any key. It was a connection that required both sides to meet in the same place. He asked again. When her mother sat down to record her final message, knowing that the Dominion was coming, knowing that she might never see her daughter again, what had she been feeling? Closed her eyes. Danny watched her face as she traveled back through memory, reaching for something she had buried beneath layers of loss and pain. He saw the moment she found it, the slight softening around her eyes, the way her grip on the lunchbox loosened just a fraction. She said her mother had not been afraid. Her mother was never afraid, not even at the end. Her mother had faced every challenge with calm determination and unshakable faith that things would work out the way they were meant to. Even when the sky had turned to fire and the world had begun to crumble, her mother had been thinking only of her daughter's safety, only of hope, only of love. Danny said that perhaps the stone was waiting for to meet her mother where she was. Perhaps the recording could not be unlocked with grief, because grief was not what her mother had put into it. Perhaps the stone needed to find her way back to hope, to love, to the strength her mother had shown in those final moments. Opened her eyes. They were wet with tears, but there was something new there too, a spark of possibility that had not existed a moment before. She took the memory stone out of the lunchbox and held it in her palm. Danny watched as she closed her eyes again and breathed deeply, her whole body settling into stillness. He did not know what she was doing, what inner journey she was taking, but he could see the effort in the set of her jaw and the slight trembling of her hands. Minutes passed. The sounds of the schoolyard faded into background noise, distant and unimportant. The universe narrowed to this small space beneath the oak tree, to an old soldier and a young girl and a crystal that held the last words of a mother to her child. Then the stone began to glow. The light started faint, barely visible in the afternoon sun, but it grew stronger, pulsing with warmth, until the crystal in his hand shone like a captured star. And then a voice emerged, soft and melodic, speaking words in the language that Danny could not understand. But he did not need to understand the words. He understood the tone. He heard love in every syllable, fierce and boundless and unconditional. He heard pride and hope, and the unbreakable certainty that this child would survive, would thrive, would carry the best of her people forward into whatever future awaited. The message lasted perhaps 2 minutes. When it ended, the glow faded slowly, reluctantly, as if the stone did not want to let go of the connection it had finally made. Sat motionless for a long moment. Tears streamed down her pale blue cheeks, but she was smiling. It was the first real smile Danny had ever seen on her face, and it transformed her from a ghost into a child again. She told him what her mother had said. She translated the words haltingly, struggling to capture their meaning in a language that was not her own. Her mother had told her to live, not just to survive, but to live fully and completely. Her mother had said that the greatest tribute to those who are gone is not endless mourning but joyful existence. Her mother had asked her to honor the dead by making their sacrifice meaningful, by building a life worth living, by carrying their memory not as a burden but as a blessing. Her mother had told her she was loved beyond measure, and she always would be. Danny felt something shift in his own chest as he listened. He thought about his friends who had died in the war, about the years he had spent carrying their memory like a stone around his neck. He wondered if they would want him to live the way Mother wanted her daughter to live. He suspected they would. He reached out and rested his hand briefly on his shoulder. He said her mother sounded like an extraordinary person. He said he was honored to be the one sitting with her when she finally heard that message. Wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at Danny with an expression he had never seen before, gratitude and affection, and something that might have been the beginning of healing. She said thank you. She said she could not have done it without him. Danny said that was not true. He said the strength had always been inside her. He had just helped her remember where to find it. Danny found the package waiting in his maintenance locker when he arrived at work the next morning. It was a small container wrapped in pale blue cloth, tied with a simple ribbon. There was no note attached, but he knew immediately who had left it. He opened it carefully and found food inside. Food, arranged with obvious care on a bed of leaves he did not recognize. There were small round cakes that smelled faintly of flowers, and strips of something that might have been fruit, and a handful of crystalline candies that caught the light like tiny jewels. Simple fare from the Refugee Assistance Center, but transformed by attention and intention into something that felt like a gift from the heart. A piece of paper tucked beneath the food held a message in shaky common script. "Thank you for sitting with me." Danny stood in his locker room for a long time, holding that container in his hands. He had received medals during his military service. He had been given commendations and honors, and all the symbols that grateful governments bestow upon those who serve. None of them had ever meant as much as this small package of food from a child who had finally found the strength to hope again. When lunch came, he walked to the oak tree with his usual sandwich and found already there. But something was different. Her lunchbox sat open beside her, and inside he could see food. Real food. She had packed a meal from the refugee center, the same simple rations she had brought him, arranged on the same kind of leaves. She looked up at him with those enormous silver eyes, and he saw nervousness there alongside determination. She said she had eaten breakfast that morning. She said it was the first time in months she had eaten a full meal by herself. She said she had cried through most of it, but she had finished every bite. Danny sat down in his spot and nodded. He said that sounded hard. He said he was proud of her. picked up one of the small cakes from her lunch and held it in her hand. She stared at it for a moment, and Danny could see the battle playing out across her face. Old habits fighting against new resolve, grief wrestling with the memory of her mother's words. Then she took a bite, small, tentative, but real. Danny began eating his own sandwich, and they sat together in comfortable silence while they shared their first meal. It was nothing like the telepathic bond had known with her mother. There was no warm thread of connection linking their minds, but there was something else, something that Danny had almost forgotten existed. There was companionship. There was the simple comfort of not being alone. They were finishing their food when Administrator appeared at the edge of the schoolyard. She walked toward them with measured steps, her four arms folded in a posture Danny had learned indicated careful thought. She stopped a respectful distance away and asked if she might speak with them. Danny glanced at, who nodded slightly. He told the Administrator she was welcome to say whatever she needed to say. Administrator explained that word had spread through the refugee community. People had learned about the human groundskeeper who sat every day with the orphan girl. At first, as she had warned Danny, there had been disapproval. Some elders had questioned whether it was appropriate. Some had worried about cultural contamination and the dilution of traditions. But then the story had changed. People had learned that was eating again. They had heard that she had finally accessed her mother's memory stone after months of silence. They had discovered that a human who owed her nothing had given her his time and patience and presence when her own people had kept their distance. Several families had contacted the Refugee Services Office. They wanted to meet. They wanted to offer her a place in their households, a chance to grow up within the embrace of her own culture while carrying the lessons she had learned from an unexpected friend. His hand found Danny's arm, her grip tight with sudden fear. He covered her fingers with his own and told her it was all right. He told her this was a good thing. She asked if she would have to stop seeing him. Danny smiled and said that family did not work that way. He said that the people who loved you did not disappear when new people came into your life. He said that the heart had room for more connections than anyone could count, and that adding new bonds did not weaken the ones that already existed. He told her something else too. He told her that wherever she ended up, whoever became her family, she would always be welcome at the oak tree during lunch. He would be there every day, rain or shine, for as long as she wanted to come. Administrator watched this exchange with an expression Danny could not quite read. Then she said something that surprised him. She said the families had asked about him too. They wanted to meet the human who had done what they had failed to do. They wanted to thank him. Danny shook his head. He said there was nothing to thank him for. He said he had just been sitting with a kid who needed someone to sit with her. He said any decent person would have done the same. The administrator made a sound that might have been disagreement, but she did not argue. She said the meetings would be arranged for the following week and that she would keep Danny informed. After she left, took the memory stone from her lunchbox and set it on the grass between them. It glowed softly in the afternoon light, no longer hidden, no longer something to be protected from the world. She said she was scared about meeting the families. She said she did not know if she was ready to have new parents. Danny said that was probably how it should feel. He said that big changes were supposed to be scary, and that courage was not about being unafraid, but about moving forward despite the fear. He said something else too. He said he had been thinking about what her mother's message meant, not just for, but for himself. He said he had spent years hiding from life, taking a job where no one expected anything from him, avoiding connections because connections meant the possibility of loss. He said that last night he had gone to the Refugee Community Center and signed up to help with meal preparation. He said it was a small thing, maybe meaningless, but it felt like a step in a direction he had been afraid to walk for too long. Smiled at him, bright and real, and said it did not sound meaningless to her. The bell rang to call the children back to class. gathered her things, including the memory stone which she no longer hid in the lunchbox but carried openly in her hand. She paused before leaving and turned back to face Danny. She said that she had finally understood something. She said that her mother's message was not just about honoring the dead. It was about recognizing that love did not end when someone was gone. It lived on in the people they had touched, in the connections they had made, in the ripples that spread outward long after the stone that caused them had sunk beneath the surface. Danny thought about that for the rest of the day. He thought about his fallen friends and the lives they had touched. He thought about his own life, smaller than he had wanted it to be, safer than was probably healthy. He thought about a little girl with silver eyes who had taught him more about courage in a few weeks than 20 years of warfare ever had. That evening, he sat on his porch and watched the stars appear, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not feel alone. Somewhere out there, under the same sky, a child was eating dinner with strangers who might become family. And tomorrow, under an old oak tree on a frontier world far from Earth, they would share a meal again and talk about the future instead of the past. It was not much. It was barely anything at all. But Danny had learned that barely anything was exactly where miracles began.